Excellent. Hello, welcome. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much as well for your patience with a few technical difficulties, which often happen with these kinds of sessions, but we're going to keep it moving and make it work. We've got some really phenomenal speakers today to talk about the topic of making media work for HIV justice. And this is a community webinar that's really giving an overview of media engagement for advocates who are working to oppose HIV criminalization in various contexts around the world. And our objectives here today are really to introduce our attendees to some key concepts and some key practices. Oh, next slide, please, by the way. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
And when I see the slide, we'll move on. Hi, everyone. I love the chat box hellos. Jenny, is everything okay with the slide moving?
Did you not, I would just moved it, do you not see the next one?
No, it's still on the title one.
Really? I see the next one on mine. Hold on a second.
Really? No, it's okay. There we go. I also don't see the full slide. I just see part of it. Oh, actually, that's my own fault because I had one. Sorry, don't listen to me. So really thank you so much. So the slides are now moving, which is awesome. So our objectives are really to introduce those who have gathered here to some key concepts and practices that are highlighted in a recent toolkit that was launched by HIV Justice Worldwide called Making Media Work for HIV Justice, and an introductory toolkit and an introduction to media engagement for advocates opposing HIV criminalization. And you know, because that document itself is so rich, it really isn't possible. Each section of it could be a webinar in itself or several. So this is really going to be kind of a top-level introduction to some of the concepts in the toolkit, and we'll kind of tease, frankly, some of the ones that are in some of the concepts that you can find by downloading the toolkit for yourself. But we will get the opportunity to engage more deeply with a few of the topic areas through the experience of and knowledge of the expert panelists that we have here today, who I'll introduce in just a moment. So next slide, please.
Can you see the next slide?
Nope, not yet.
Oh my goodness, what is going on with this?
I know, just a wee delay.
You see it now?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. So the person speaking right now is Olivia Ford, and I'm moderating this panel, which means that by the time we get going, I'll be doing the least of the talking. I'm based in New Orleans, Louisiana, USA, and I see that there's some New Orleans folks in the house as well. I am a freelance editor and writer. I was the primary author on Making Media Work for HIV Justice. And I'm really, really excited to introduce our other 5 panelists who have been working around these issues for many years. Our first panelist to be introduced is Ellie De Akane. She's the Executive Director of Journalists Against AIDS Nigeria, or J-AIDS Nigeria, a leading media-based non-governmental organization which seeks to contribute to the prevention, care, and control of HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and reproductive health issues in Nigeria. And Olayide has served over the past 15 years in various capacities in J-AIDS and other advocacy-based organizations. Our second panelist is Janet Butler McPhee. Janet is the Director of Communications and Advocacy for the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, an organization that promotes the human rights of people living with, at risk of, or affected by HIV or AIDS in Canada and internationally. Our third panelist is Chikondi Chijozi from the Center for Human Rights Education, Advice, and Assistance, or SHREA, in Malawi. Chikondi is the Deputy Executive Director as well as a litigation manager at SHREA. She started working as a human rights defender in 2004 when she joined SHREA as a paralegal officer, and she's now a legal practitioner and holds a Master of Laws in International Human Rights Law. from the University of Sussex in the UK, and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Malawi. And she's passionate about the rights of women and children in detention, has been involved in human rights interest litigation to fight for non-custodial sentences for women with children in prison and LGBTI rights. And she's also a member of the Malawi Law Society. So next up, we have Nick Holas, who also wins the award, at least among the panelists, for the oddest hour to join a webinar, as he's based in Melbourne, Australia, where it is currently probably about 1:15 a.m. In addition to having authored with me, he authored the 4 Tips for Journalists supplement and did a beautiful job with that work as part of the Making Media Work for HIV Justice Toolkit. He's also an HIV activist, writer, and co-founder of the Institute of Many, an advocacy platform and grassroots movement for people living with HIV. TIM has the largest membership of any HIV organization in Australia and has been identified as a major player in the nation's modern-day HIV response, delivering grassroots activism, digital campaigns, resources, events, and digital community spaces since 2012. And finally, we have Jenny Smith-Camejo, who's also on the who's kind of on the wheels, helping us with technical support from the Positive Women's Network USA, and she is the communications director at Positive Women's Network USA. She came to the organization in October 2015 from the world of labor organizing, where she provided communication support for a wide variety of organizing, political, social justice, and worker contract campaigns. And her work in communications runs the gamut from press outreach to blogging to website and social media maintenance and engagement to training members in messaging to graphic design. And she came into communications in a really grassroots way. She was a media spokesperson, blogger, and legislative relations co-chair for a teachers union in her past life as a high school teacher. Welcome, everyone. It is really, really wonderful to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to your being able to share your expertise and voices with this kind of global body of participants that we have on the webinar as well. Next slide, please, Jenny.
Can you see it?
Nope. I think there's just a slight delay. I know. I'll holler when I see it. Okay, still seeing the longer the labels than before. Still seeing the panelist slide.
I don't understand why I'm having so much problem with this today. I'm sorry.
Here we go. Oh, we jumped ahead a couple.
Oh, so I guess it's
there. Oh, beautiful. That worked. Just a little bit about HIV Justice Worldwide. HIV Justice Worldwide is a global campaign to abolish criminal and similar laws, policies, and practices that regulate, control, and punish people living with HIV based on their HIV positive status. And it's got a really important structure. It's run by a 10-member steering committee. I'll just let the slide linger for just a moment as I speak so that people can read them themselves, but I won't read the entire slide. The toolkit was produced by Positive Women's Network USA on behalf of HIV Justice Worldwide as part of their membership in that consortium. Next slide, please. I'll just start talking about the what's on the next slide as it's moving. Just to say a little bit more about the Making Media Work for HIV Justice Toolkit. Oh, that moved very quickly, which is lovely. It's really meant to provide information and tools to global grassroots advocates that are engaged in or want to be engaged in rapid or proactive media response to instances of HIV criminalization, and to really demystify the process and the practice of working with media and working through media as part of an overall advocacy strategy, which we'll talk about a couple of the nuts and bolts around aligning those strategies in a little bit. And really, we stress in the toolkit that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions when it comes to really anything having to do with media, and particularly around criminalization. Issues can be very particulars, and nuances can be very context-specific. So the toolkit is really meant to provide resources to start conversations among advocates so that they can create context-appropriate solutions to guide their media work sort of based on what is going to be most effective in their areas. And it's geared towards community advocates, though it also includes, as I mentioned before, authored by Nick, the Covering HIV Criminalization supplement, essentially, 4 tips for journalists that appears at the kind of end of the toolkit. And of course, it was released last month. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hazard a guess that we have a pretty knowledgeable audience here regarding this kind of basics of HIV criminalization. But I did want us to have up on the screen a kind of working definition as we go forward into the this session and talking about these issues more deeply through the lens of media and even partnerships with media. So we know that criminalization describes the unjust use of criminal law or similar laws to really punish and control the behavior of people living with HIV based on their HIV status. And we're talking about behavior that is overwhelmingly, we're talking about consensual behavior, essentially. So it's a growing global phenomenon. It's, just paradoxically, the number of countries that have enacted such laws have actually increased since the epidemic's earlier days and years when, in recent years when powerful HIV medications have become available to improve and extend the lives of people who are able to access them. So really the kind of dubious and really false notion that these laws play a public health purpose is sort of debunked by that fact as they actually kind of block the progress that we're making in public health. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. And we'll talk a lot more about the fact that these laws ignore widely available scientific and medical evidence related to HIV and to the realities of living with HIV today. These are exceedingly vague or broad laws. Under them, virtually anyone living with HIV could be prosecuted just for the fact that they are living with a health condition. And of course, they're based on, we often talk about these laws as being based on, being grounded in a time when we knew very little about the virus. They're based on past quote unquote myths and misconceptions, but we know that because this is a growing phenomenon, that those misconceptions and that stigma is still very much a part of the lives of people living with HIV, working in HIV worldwide, and are part of our task to shift as people working in media and language. Next slide, please. Awesome. Again, so going to the fact that these laws are really decoupled from science, have nothing to do with current science. They allow prosecution for acts that constitute usually no or vanishing low risk of HIV transmission. And they really disproportionately affect communities that are already affected by policing. That's people of color, women, trans folks, sex workers, who are already vulnerable to human rights abuses, mass incarceration, et cetera. And there's no, again, to stress that there is, and I think that this is really surprising to a lot of folks, especially folks who are new to the topic, but even within the community, that there's no evidence that these laws deter behavior that can transmit HIV or reduce new HIV cases. Next slide, please. So again, in case anyone who's on the call needs any convincing, I mean, really, the reason why media matters so is such a key tool in opposing HIV criminalization is that that media is really the field on which the lives of people who are accused under HIV criminalization laws, statutes, or using other laws to do that, to enact that criminalizing, are really destroyed. That inaccurate, bias, and excessive media coverage is kind of in the front lines of ruining the lives of people who essentially run afoul of these laws for no wrongdoing of their own. And this media coverage can even affect the outcomes of criminal proceedings. And just in general, HIV-related reporting tends towards being sensationalized and stigmatizing and can often do more harm than good. And really is a lens for seeing that mainstream media is really a site for reinforcing a given society's prejudices. And we see that really in sharp relief when we're talking about HIV criminalization. So when we do the work of shifting these messages and these images in the media regarding HIV criminalization, we're really talking about culture shift and changing a culture of bias in media towards communities that are living with and vulnerable to HIV. Next slide, please. This one will be a quick one. So what can we do? And again, in the, you can move along to the next slide, actually. Yeah, you can move to the next slide. That was just a quick stop on that slide. So again, the toolkit, hopefully everyone will have the opportunity to download it themselves and get even deeper into some of these issues. One section that that was included in the toolkit is this concept of kind of first do no harm. And it may seem kind of a silly thing to include because people engage in advocacy because they desire to help and not harm the people that they're working with in the communities that they're supporting. But it's really important with criminalization to be very careful and thoughtful to ensure that the actions that are taken are not going to harm a person being criminalized, their case, or the community as a whole. And how that can happen oftentimes is, there's often a desire to see immediate and broad media coverage of an issue related to criminalization. When we learn that this practice is so deeply unjust, we want to spread the word to the world. We want to sort of put out the stories of people who are criminalized in sort of the most far-reaching media outlets that we can access. But I really urge advocates to have patience because now is not always the right time for media visibility of an issue. We will get to, that's really a topic that's delved into a lot more deeply within the toolkit. There are examples of situations in which a desire to kind of jump the gun a little bit and get eager with media coverage early on or at an awkward, at an inappropriate time within a case has actually had a detrimental effect on the case or a person. Definitely keeping in touch with those who are working most closely on the law case. That could be legal counsel, the person themselves who's criminalized, advocates based in an area where a statute is being challenged. And of course, just making sure that messages don't reinforce stigmatizing ideas about people living with HIV. I think that oftentimes we get, even folks within the community who have really spent many years sort of challenging the idea of quote unquote innocent victims or, kind of people who behaved, perfectly, they used a condom, they had an undetectable viral load, and still they were criminalized. It's absolutely true that this is unjust, but it's unjust because no one should be criminalized for having a health condition, not because people who are, for whatever reason, unable to maintain an undetectable viral load or even transmitted HIV should be subject to being criminalized. So it's really important. And again, that's something that we're going to talk about much later in the toolkit. And if you want kind of more examples of how to not reinforce stigma in our own language when speaking about criminalization, I urge you to look to the kind of meaty document in the toolkit. So now part of having patience around and being deliberate with media strategy is to really think critically about how to align that media strategy with an overall advocacy strategy. So as we plan for advocacy work, so must we plan for media work. And next slide, please. And at this point, I get to draw from the wisdom of my esteemed panelists here. So now this first question I'm going to put to Jenny Smith-Camejo in the U.S. In working on campaigns, I would love for you to speak from your experience. You're both in HIV specifically and in other areas of activism. In working on campaigns opposing HIV criminalization, why is it important to align our media strategy with our overall advocacy strategy? Jenny?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, and I apologize again for the technical difficulties. I don't know what's going on today, but hopefully you can see the slides okay now. So thank you, Olivia. Yeah, so I think that it's really I think that a lot of times advocates are very focused on change, on whatever the thing that they're trying to move is. So in the case of HIV criminalization, obviously the focus is trying to change the laws. And so a lot of attention rightly gets put on what needs to happen in terms of finding legislative champions, if we're talking about actually, moving legislation that would change the laws, and finding, and rounding up and sort of organizing advocates and activists to, to be talking to these legislators, to be talking to folks in their community, to build more support. Like, these are very critical parts of any campaign. Sometimes I feel like media strategy sort of gets overlooked until it's a little bit late. Just, and because everyone is so focused on, moving the parts that need to happen to change the law, people kind of forget that media can have a really big impact, and it can be positive or negative. And so I think, if when you're thinking of your plan, like what, all the steps that you need to take to change a law, for example, media has to be part of that. And that doesn't mean that you have to be saying, okay, we're going to send out a press release, on April 1st that we are going to change this law. It doesn't mean that you have to have necessarily a proactive media strategy. It means you need to consider the role of media. And again, that could be positive or negative, and whether or not you want to proactively seek media, at what point in the campaign you would want to proactively seek media. And there's also just the reality that regardless of whether you want to proactively seek media or not, you do need to be prepared to respond to media, because sometimes you get media coverage and it's not something that you were going for. It's not something that you actively sought. It's something that happens because word gets out. A reporter was sitting in the legislative session when they were discussing, in a committee, when they were discussing the bill that you finally got a legislative champion for, or somebody is opposed to it and they put out an op-ed in the newspaper, and now, different media is kind of seizing on it. And so I think it's important to, with something as sensitive as HIV criminalization and something as misunderstood as HIV is in general, especially, I don't want to say especially in the US, because I think it's obviously globally a problem. But, I'm based here in the US, so that's the perspective that I'm most familiar with. With something as sensitive as that, it doesn't really make sense in a lot of cases to announce what you're trying to do in terms of changing laws to a broad public, especially in the early stages. Because I think what that can do in some cases is just kind of rile up opposition where you may not have had any before. And so if, for example, if you send out a press release saying, we are going to change this law, that criminalizes people who are living with HIV for non-disclosure, a broad swath of the public is going to say, but wait, isn't that law good? Like, I wouldn't want somebody to be able to, to give me HIV like that. And it's a very people don't really understand all the nuances. They don't understand the realities of what does and does not constitute a risk of transmission. There are just so many different nuances there that the average person who's just sitting there, looking at the news on their phone or reading a newspaper, that they're not going to understand that. And so then what you can find is you have a whole bunch of people who are all of a sudden speaking up in opposition. And what that can mean on the ground is that, legislators who might have been very amenable to hearing what you had to say about why these laws were dangerous and why, or just didn't make any sense or worked against public health, they might have been very receptive to those arguments. But once there's, a public outcry about it and there's organized opposition, then they might be, really quick to kind of move away from that because they don't really see what they're going to gain from supporting it, but they see what they could lose from supporting it. So even if privately they agree with you, if they feel like it's going to cause you know, a lot of public outcry and opposition, then they're probably going to move away from it. And that can go for folks who are friendly as well, you know, and more progressive, as well as more conservative legislators. So I think it's, and what, you know, what we've seen is sometimes when you get, for example, with the law in California, that we were able to, you know, get changed last year, which was a great victory. But there was, you know, that there was media coverage earlier than we would have wanted, really. And some of it was fine. Some of it was pretty objective, pretty neutral. And then some of it was pretty bad. And I think, you know, even though we were able to, the legislation still passed in California, eventually the governor signed it, though it took a minute. So even though it was successful in California, despite having some, you know, kind of negative media coverage, I am concerned about the impact that that could have on efforts in other states that are less progressive than California. You know, because for example, here in Florida, where I currently live, you know, there are some advocates who are working very hard on changing law, led by the Cero Project. They're you know, working on changing the criminalization laws here in Florida, and you know, I'm hopeful that some of the negative media coverage that came out of the California effort is not going to sort of deter lawmakers here in Florida, which is a much more conservative state. You know, I'm hoping that that's not going to kind of have this sort of ripple effect and influence them. So I think that's, you know, just something that we have to keep in mind. So if you know, if you have a legislative champion, a legislator who's willing to introduce legislation or co-sponsor legislation, and, you know, they're kind of working behind the scenes to get folks on board, then for it to go out in the media publicly really early on, that, like I said, that could deter other lawmakers from signing on in support, and it could kill the bill. So I think, you know, being very mindful about sort of waiting and feeling out the waters, and probably not really trying to go public is generally a good strategy. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, you always want to be ready to respond to media. So if it does get out, you want to know, you know, what you're going to say, how you're going to respond. And in some cases, if it's one article, you may not want to respond at all. You may want to just hope that it doesn't, you know, go any further than that and let it go. I know that's what we've done in some cases. In other cases, if there's a whole lot of articles that come out, or it seems to be making a stir, then you may want to respond. If you have a reporter who calls and says, "Hey, I hear that you've been working on this. You know, can you tell me about it?" You want to have some talking points ready. And we find that, like, trying to get into the weeds, as we say, you know, getting into the little details of the existing laws and the ways that we're trying to change it is usually not going to be very helpful. So just having really broad talking points about why HIV criminalization is not good for public health, despite, you know, what some people may think, or despite what a first impression of the laws may be, that, you know, that they work against public health, that they are unfair, that they do not actually prevent HIV transmission. In fact, they can work against prevention efforts, and, you know, that they're based on really outdated and frankly inaccurate science, and that for that alone, that, you know, they don't make sense and need to be changed. So having some really good broad talking points about why HIV criminalization in general is bad is really preferable to getting into, you know, the finer details of the existing laws and the ways that you're trying to change them.
Excellent. Jenny, thank you so much. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Ah, thank goodness. I had a tiny personal technical difficulty there, but I'm so glad y'all can hear me, and thank you so much for that response. Also for bringing up that the example of California, which is discussed in an example in the toolkit as well. So thank you for sort of for bringing that perspective to the panel here today. Do any other panelists have anything to add? We've got another about a minute or two before we move on to the next question. If anyone else has any experiences based on their own context that they'd like to share. I'm hearing another voice as well. Hello? Hello? What else? was hearing that. But do any other panelists have anything to add? If you want to come off mute for just a moment and add to that response. Give you about 5 seconds to say you'd like to respond. Okay, so hearing none, I'll quickly alert our participants to the Q&A box. If you would like to ask a question, I see people are already asking questions in the box, which is fine and great. The best way for us to receive them is to go down to the very bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see some little tools and things pop up, including a box that says Q&A, if I understand correctly what you're seeing. And you can enter questions in there, which we will come to in the Q&A section at the end of the session. And we're really going to try to have a good amount of time to respond to folks' questions. And we'll hold all questions to the end, whether they the chat box or they come in the Q&A box. But again, we are planning to have a good amount of time to address a few questions. So thank you so much to folks who have already asked questions. And one that I can answer quickly is that the talking point examples used for response are available in the toolkit. Yes, they are. And there are also links in the toolkit to other resources. So the toolkit itself doesn't have every resource in the world in it, but hopefully it has some pathways to others, so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel with this particular toolkit, but it can be a clearinghouse of other resources that are available elsewhere. Next slide, please. So our next question I'm going to pose to Ellie De Akane at J-AIDS, Journalists Against AIDS in Nigeria. And it would be wonderful to hear you speak based on your really extensive experience working from the perspective of a journalist working in HIV. Ms. Akane, how have you seen advocates begin to build relationships with members of the media? I know this is something that comes up quite a lot in folks' advocacy work. Yeah, I hear someone else's phone coming in and out. Just make sure if you're speaking, you're unmuted, and if you're not speaking, that you're muted. So now, how do advocates begin to build relationships with members of the media, and what approaches have been effective in starting and maintaining these conversations and these relationships? Olivia?
Okay, thank you very much, Olivia, and thanks for the great work you're doing. So from our experience, oftentimes advocates and journalists view themselves with media mutual suspicion. So you really need to build trust, and building trust takes a while. For instance, in my work so first of all, I worked as a journalist before I now began to work as an advocate that also trains journalists. One of the things that we realized, first of all, in the HIV and AIDS epidemic in Nigeria was the media played a great role in fueling myths and misconceptions and stigmatization about people living with HIV. So it took a while to actually, engage the media so we had series of trainings, we had trainings in which you had people living with HIV also come to facilitate. And at that time of the epidemic, one of the questions that was always key on the journalist's mind was, oh, okay, so how do you get infected? Who infected you? And it took a while to be able to debunk that and say, hey, the issue now is not about how he or she got infected. The issue is about educating people and ensuring that we prevent new infections. So it took a while, trainings and all of that. But one of the things we also realized in the course of trying to build relationships with the media was also understand how journalists operate. Because, you get the sense that, okay, once I've trained a journalist, he or she should report HIV and AIDS ever after. And you realize that within the media space, there are bottlenecks and there are challenges that the journalist faces. So there was a need to take cognizance of all of that. So for instance, the journalist tells us, okay, I understand the issues. I understand the need to use appropriate language. I understand the need to use non-stigmatizing language. But so I submit my story and then the editor recasts the headline or he changes it to something sensational. It's not my fault. I've done my bit. So we realized that it wasn't just enough to train the journalist. You needed to also go a step further and also engage the editors. And there were editors who felt, oh, we were just making a lot of noise about HIV, and it took actually getting people living with HIV to engage with them to also help them understand why HIV needed to be on the front burner of public discourse, particularly in the news, so that took a while. But for me, the turning point in our work with journalists was a case that happened some years back. So we had a person living with HIV who had applied to a journalism school, to study journalism. And he had applied and told the rector of the school in confidence that on the last Friday of every month, I'll be absent from school because I need to go pick up my drugs in another city. And the lady said, okay, fine, no problem. And the next time when he got back to school, at the gate, he was told, oh, sorry, your application has been cancelled. You cannot study in this school anymore. No reasons were given, but we sensed that it was because of his HIV status. Anyway, we called a press conference and the journalists there were like outraged, like, how can this happen in an institution that trains one of us? And if this is something against one of us, it's an indictment on all of us. So they really took it up, and the journalists themselves became advocates for this guy. There were several news articles, editorials calling for his reinstatement. It took a while. It took about 1.5 years, but down the line, the guy was reinstated back to school, and he's actually now a practicing journalist reporting issues, in different issues, including HIV and AIDS, in the media house where he works. But over that period of time, one of the things we realized, or one of the lessons we learned, was the reason why the journalists could take that up was because they had moved from just being informed about HIV and AIDS to seeing HIV and AIDS as a personal issue that they needed to communicate. That was one. The other thing that we realized was that we needed to take into cognizance the various house styles of the media houses. So I know some media houses are sensationalist in their approach. They're more like, they always sensationalize things. So advocates would necessarily need to understand, okay, what are the ethics of this media house? How do they operate? If I share the issues with this media house, will it be misinterpreted? Are there journalists that we can have as allies? And over that period of time, we realized that there were some journalists who, because of their understanding, were more balanced in their reporting than others. And so it was easy to engage with them over time and consistently engage with them. The other thing we realized in working with journalists over time is that, the fact that you train a journalist is not enough. So training is not enough. You need to have opportunities to engage with journalists on a regular basis, to update them on, what's going on, what the issues are, so that they are able to report from an informed perspective. And so we had started at that time what we called media roundtables, which were opportunities every 2 months to bring together people who are working in different fields of HIV to talk to the media about, the issues that they're facing, the challenges, and then the journalists were able to report that in an informed perspective. We also had what we called an award ceremony at that time. And the idea behind the awards was to understand that, to also recognize outstanding media contributions to the HIV and AIDS response, because we know that, whatever achievements that we're making within the HIV and AIDS response as per reducing the onset of new infections, the media also plays a role because they also communicate with the public. And so because of that award and because of the fact that the media was also recognized, we were able to build and form more alliances with the media and strengthen those relationships, such that if anything happened, within the AIDS response, the journalists will call you up and say, hey, I heard this, what's the real story? How do we report it? Because it had come to a point where they trusted us and we trusted some of them. Now, some of the time, the relationship is not always rosy all the way, but I think it's critical to understand where the journalist is coming from and try to meet them halfway. The other thing that we also did, and in some of, so we also recommended some of our advocates should do, is that, if you're planning any activity, probably a long-term project, get the media involved from the onset. Don't just call the journalist to come and cover your event when you're having a media event. involve them in the strategizing to say, okay, this is the project we're running. This is what it entails. How can you help us? How can we work together to put the news out there, to put accurate information out there, to educate the public? And you'll be surprised that we had very innovative ideas coming out from the journalists who said, okay, you know what, these are the things that you can do. These are the ways that we can help you. These are the ways that we can take on this course, as journalists ourselves, and it wouldn't have to cost you. Because sometimes getting the media to cover events or be a part of some issues, you might have to pay, and so the journalists themselves were the ones who came up with some ideas and some suggestions on how we could run things better. So I think that for me, the key learning is about the need to build trust and the need to help, to ensure that the journalists understand where you're coming from and you also understand where they are coming from. Now, building that trust is not going to happen overnight. It takes time. And you really do need to be patient to be able to build those allies within the media. But the truth of the matter is, once you have those allies, you have them for a long time. And some of the journalists that we worked with when we were doing a lot of training and reporting on HIV and AIDS are the same journalists that we're working now with down the line, 10 years down the line, talking about TB issues and other HIV-related issues. So I think the point is that oftentimes, journalists and advocates come with, suspicion. It's always like an us versus them thing. But if we come to that point when we realize that, look, we're in it for the common good, and we do have a mutual agenda, and how can we reinforce our roles together, and how can we build partnerships and allies as we advocate on issues, then you're likely to have a much more rich and much more robust partnership. Of course, this is not to say that it's rosy all the way. There will always be issues where somebody reports something from a really nasty or a very confusing perspective, and you're wondering how on earth, based on, why did you do what you did and stuff like that. But the thing again is to ensure that, look, whichever way it is, you're also using those kind of platforms to correct and educate. And I'm happy that, we're having this kind of toolkit, because oftentimes, journalists use terminologies that are in themselves stigmatizing, not because they want to, but because they don't know better. And that, and once they know better, they are probably going to be likely to take on those new terminologies. Sometimes there's a bit of resistance. I remember early back then, it was easier for a journalist to say HIV victim. And we're like, no, you're not a victim because you have HIV. Just use the term person living with HIV. And the argument was, oh, that is too long, how many words is that going to take in the space that I have to do my story? But over time, when journalists began to realize that, look, this was international terminology, and it was terminology recommended by UNAIDS and key partners working on HIV and AIDS, then they began to take it on slowly. So the change can happen and trusts can be built, but it takes time and it does take patience. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That response that really covered so many aspects of what's so important about not only working with journalists, absolutely, and then other aspects of the way that we engage with this work around HIV and HIV criminalization. So many, many, many thanks. Ellie De Akane. I'm going to ask Jen if you'd move to the next slide, please. And that happened so quickly. Great. I'll just go through this one very quickly because, again, I really want there to be space for panelists that are really bringing the richness to this conversation to speak. But I just want to make sure that we have a working definition of what a message is as we get to talking about kind of getting the message right around HIV criminalization. It's come up a number of times already. So, of course, that's the information you convey using words or symbols that communicates the essence of what your group is working toward. And again, as Laide said earlier, the words that people choose to talk about a given issue are by no means neutral. The words that are chosen affect how a person's going to perceive and understand that issue going forward. You know, a word or phrase will trigger kind of a set of associations that will draw our listener to one way of understanding that issue. You know, and just the way that if you think about a frame on a painting, that frame where the artist or whoever's framing it, the framer or the person in the museum chooses to put the frame, defines what part of the total picture a viewer is going to see. And likewise, a stories frame or a message frame defines what part of the story the consumer of that story is going to hear or not hear. So a message frame is really how makers of media are defining or packaging and presenting an issue. And really one of our tasks in HIV in general, and specifically around criminalization, is really getting away from portrait frame, which really focuses on individual behavior, personal responsibility only. You know, it was this person's fault, quote unquote. It had to do with their flaws, quote unquote. How they kind of, why they didn't disclose their HIV status or just whatever the HIV-related issue is that's being reported on, that really shifting from that kind of a frame to a landscape frame. Think of a landscape, like a landscape picture, like when you take one that's kind of, you know, it can show multiple elements interacting with one another, and in messaging that kind of refers to the broader social, political, legal contexts that we're talking about in which people live their lives and in which these unjust HIV criminalization laws are enacted. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I really want to move on to really, really important aspects of the discussion. Next slide, please. Around that messaging and message framing in the context of HIV criminalization. This is a question for Janet Butler-McPhee. What are some of the dominant narratives that advocates working around criminalization must work to reframe? Janet?
Sure.
Yeah, hi.
So I should first say I'm located in Toronto, Canada, but the dominant narratives around HIV criminalization we see are pervasive in most parts of the world. And while the dominant narratives about which I'll be speaking are seen most regularly in what we think of as mainstream media, they're certainly not unique to mainstream media. And in fact, I'd say these narratives are also pervasive in some alternative and more rarely niche LGBTQI+ media sources. And I think this is probably not surprising given that there's a lot of discourse around HIV criminalization, though sometimes there's still also silence around it, within communities that are particularly affected by HIV, and that would include the LGBTQI+ community. So because of this discourse, and certainly because of dissenting opinions within these communities, these narratives also exist on the ground. Often, and again, unsurprisingly, I think, the framing of HIV criminalization within community settings is influenced by what community members are seeing, reading, hearing in the media. And this happens subconsciously, as we know in many cases, but it certainly influences how people are talking about media, how people are talking about HIV criminalization in the media and on the ground. So a few things to lead with before we get into the narratives themselves, and my fellow panelists just pointed this one out, but very relevant to the idea of dominant narratives is the fact that up until recently, the standard practice, particularly in print journalism, was that larger publications would have headline writers different from the reporters who originated the content. And we've heard from, again, my fellow panelists that this has been hugely problematic. And perhaps it's obvious, but it's worth stating that journalists are humans and thus come with their implicit and explicit biases. So once upon a time, the gold star of journalism was really considered objectivity, and their task was often described as telling a balanced, and you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes here, story. And in some media outlets, this is still the model of journalism that's used, but we're increasingly seeing the so-called end of objective journalism in many media outlets. And the idea around this is that objectivity itself was always somewhat of an illusion, and that perhaps it was never as important or desirable as we once thought it to be. So finally, I wanted to note that these dominant narratives around HIV criminalization are changing and that the conversations are changing. I came to my role as the Director of Communications for the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network about 7.5 years ago. And what we see in the media, what we saw in the media then was really different from what we see now. And it was a lot scarier, to be frank, to engage with reporters. So the changes we're seeing are really very positive. But now I'm going to shift back to what I think these dominant narratives around HIV criminalization are and why they're primarily really problematic. First, all of the narratives I want to touch on today are rooted in one overarching and really problematic assumption, and that's the assumption that HIV non-disclosure is and must remain a criminal justice issue versus a public health issue. So this requires constant challenging on the part of advocates, because it's not a given and obviously not desirable that this remains a criminal justice issue. That said, there are 5 narratives that I want to touch on, ranked in no particular order. I know that many more narratives exist, but I suspect you'll recognize some of these, and as advocates, you've likely found yourself having to counter one or more of them at some point. So, dominant narrative number 1, and this is definitely in air quotes again, the HIV monster who's often intentionally infecting innocent victims. Now, fortunately, this is a narrative that I personally am seeing fade more quickly. It's a narrative that assumes that people living with HIV are purposefully hiding their status and primarily to be deceptive, which we know is untrue. It assumes wrongly that people with HIV have some innate intent to transmit the virus. The narrative assumes having HIV automatically makes a person terrifying and a potential perpetrator of criminal activity. And I think the irony is not lost on most of us that there's no compassion for how that HIV positive person may have acquired the virus themselves, because once HIV positive, they fall into this potential perpetrator category. The narrative also assumes that othering people is acceptable, which we know again is wrong. And finally, it assumes that sexual partners of people living with HIV are innocent victims with no agency themselves. So the second dominant narrative that we see in media a lot is around HIV criminalization and very obvious blatant racism. So we've seen, particularly in Canada, we've seen this HIV monster infecting innocent victims narrative most often in the context, a very specific context of a Black man or another man of color infecting white women. In Canada, this idea was once rampant, likely due to our most famous and precedent-setting cases, which you might know as the Aziga and Maybior cases. This narrative is obviously rooted in racism and is often the most blatant when we scan media coverage over the years. So really problematic for a lot of reasons. The third dominant narrative I want to talk about is the idea that HIV criminalization is protective. And this narrative is normally seen in the context of protecting public health and protecting women. And again, air quotes all over the place here. I'm being facetious. This narrative, particularly with respect to public health, is also the one I hear used most in community settings. So if we unpack the idea that HIV criminalization protects public health, which we know it doesn't, we come to the root of it, which is this misguided idea that the public needs to know the status of would-be HIV perpetrators, that it's somehow a collective right. So it's an odd perversion of the idea of human rights. Here's a telling quote from a 2017 news report from British Columbia, Canada, and it's on the case of an alleged HIV non-disclosure. So the quote reads, "Normally, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would not disclose the medical status of a person charged with a criminal offense," said this RCMP constable. However, in this case, and after careful consideration, the public interest clearly outweighs the invasion of the accused privacy. And they, of course, use the accused name, and in this have made no efforts to hide who this person is, because they're obviously trying to warn the public in some way. So the idea that HIV criminalization is protective puts the onus on the HIV positive person only and discounts any public health messaging about everyone having agency when it comes to their sexual health. The idea that HIV criminalization is protective is rooted in the idea that HIV must be set apart from every other sexually transmitted and bloodborne infection, that somehow HIV is scarier. And the idea that HIV criminalization is protective causes media to re-victimize the accused, splashing photos and names all over the media before anyone's even brought to court. And I don't know in other jurisdictions, but we certainly have seen this a lot in Canada, and it's, for obvious reasons, very problematic. The idea that HIV criminalization can somehow improve public health outcomes by lowering rates of HIV transmission is also false. So in fact, there's no evidence to support this, as criminalization effectively gives people a reason to not get tested. And then the last part of this dominant narrative around the protective nature of HIV criminalization that I want to talk a bit about is the idea that HIV criminalization is protecting women. And this has really emerged recently when we know the exact opposite to be true. In fact, in Canada, many organizations are very frustrated at this misuse of the law of sexual assault. So for those who don't know, that's how we prosecute HIV non-disclosure in Canada, via the laws of sexual assault. So sexual assault law is being turned on its head in the case of HIV criminalization, and is not, in this context, the feminist intervention it was intended to be. So two more, stick with me here. The dominant narrative number 4, HIV is easy to transmit and is also a death sentence. So I'm not going to say much about this because I expect my colleague Nick, who's going to follow me, to discuss it when he discusses science. But I call this the counter to science narrative. We all know it isn't true. HIV isn't easy to transmit. In fact, in Canada in 2014, you'll probably be aware of this, more than 70 scientific experts published a groundbreaking statement, and they laid out in that statement just how unlikely transmission is in a number of situations, from spitting to oral sex to intercourse. So this narrative is basically a scare tactic, and it harkens back to the beginning of the epidemic when much, much less was known about HIV and AIDS. It's seriously outdated, and yet it's still pervasive in media and still pervasive in court decisions. And we see that, for example, in Canada, where a condom and a low viral load need to be present in order for a person to avoid conviction, when one of those would be fine. There's no scientific reason to necessitate both. And dominant narrative number 5, which I find exceedingly frustrating, is the idea that it's easy to disclose your HIV status, so be like Nike and just do it. And this idea is really rooted in the false notion that disclosure is somehow the morally correct thing to do. And it's what good people do, so everyone should just do it. And it's often the result of privilege and a lack of understanding of the stigma and discrimination that continue to persist. All we have to do is go right back to the HIV monster narrative we talked about a couple of minutes ago. So this narrative is really counterproductive, really judgy, and should always be challenged when we see it. As I said, so there's these 5 dominant narratives that we're experiencing today. Not an exhaustive list. You probably have other examples. But what I want to say is, thanks to strong relationships with the media, and in many instances, our collective desire, media and advocates alike, to learn and to do better, I really am seeing a noticeable shift in Canada and elsewhere. And my hope is that these narratives will continue to shift, and that other more helpful, more fact-based narratives will ultimately just take their place.
Absolutely.
That's it,
Janet,
Olivia.
thank you so much. No, yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Am I back?
Yes, I can.
Hello? Oh, good. Thank you so much, Janet. And yes, while it's not an exhaustive list, these are definitely some, in terms of dominant narrative, some of the bugaboos that we all see. So thank you so much for breaking them down so effectively. Jenny, I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide while I set up the next question, please. So now this came up it's really come up a number of times in the session so far. This idea of current HIV science and the fact that HIV criminalization laws do not align with current science. The core aspect is sort of common HIV criminalization talking points. We hear it a lot, though a challenge is how to use that messaging in our advocacy work around criminalization, how to use it as a tool in criminal law reform, and whether we ought to, because there are certainly considerations we must take into account in terms of kind of statistical realities versus the realities of people living with HIV today, and not wanting to damage people who are not able to, who for whatever reason are not in their health and their lives are not able to kind of benefit from the advances in current HIV science we often talk about. And this is talked in great detail again in the toolkit. I'll keep on saying that over and over again, but I'll stop talking now because I really want to pass over. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass this question over to Nick Holas to really go a little bit deeper into some of the useful ways that we talk about current HIV science in this context, especially as it relates to treatment advances. I will quickly tease that I know that one really exciting thing around that has to do with advances in HIV science and the really kind of fantastic kind of life-changing news that we've learned about HIV risk and harm is kind of the campaign around undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U. There's been a lot written about about the excitement around including that messaging and that assertion in our advocacy work, particularly around criminalization, and also some caveats around the limits of and the potential harm that can be done by using that messaging around HIV criminalization toolkit. And I know that Nick has done a lot of work around this as well. So I'm curious, of course, what are useful ways to talk about current HIV science, and is there anything advocates ought to be cautious about in their messaging in this area? Nick?
Thanks, Olivia. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Wonderful. Good. Great. Yeah, I think this is a really great and timely question, because I think it's it's really exciting to see an uptake in the conversation around treatment as prevention and undetectable viral loads, et cetera, and those scientific advances in HIV. And I think recently that's in big part to the U equals U movement, but it's also a conversation that many advocates have been having for a very long time. We've known for many years that the scientific advances around prevention of having an undetectable viral load, reduce the risk, and we now have zero. We now have the phrasing where we can talk about zero risk, and that is an extraordinary and tremendous advancement. But it's one that has some implications on the fight for HIV criminalisation. In all your various jurisdictions, the rate of the uptake in the conversation around undetectable viral loads and treatment as prevention, or U equals U, however it's phrased or termed in your area, may be different, and that could be down to a variety of issues around treatment access, as well as retention and care, through to just simple community awareness and belief in treatment as prevention. Here in Australia, we just did a national speaking tour as part of a national U equals U campaign that we did. And a part of that tour focused on the social impact of treatment as prevention and the science of HIV, and how it can help us pressure governments into providing healthcare, et cetera. But in that, we also made space to talk about how treatment as prevention, undetectable viral loads, U equals U, is not necessarily a solution for HIV criminalisation. And I'll go into why that is in a moment, but it does have some potential great effects or impacts when we want to talk about HIV criminalisation. For example, the scientific advances in HIV treatment could be very useful to show that much of the criminalised HIV risk, and I'm using air quotes there too, is non-existent in incidences particularly of exposure or non-disclosure. If someone's being charged for exposure or non-disclosure, that they are undetectable, obviously one would hope that should immediately cancel that out, although we're seeing that it's not. Although here where I am in the state of Victoria, I know there are some movements at a public health level in acknowledging anyone with an undetectable viral load is not necessarily a risk. So when a complaint is raised against them, and I know I just a couple of weeks ago, a person living with HIV who's part of our network here had a complaint raised against them by a former partner, and that complaint went straight to public health. It didn't thankfully go through to police. It went to the public health channel, and that person was contacted by public health. Their medical records were accessed, and they were shown to have an undetectable viral load, and that's where that complaint stopped. So it did not progress. So that is, that's an instance of where it's good. But of course, the issue there is, what about those people who, for whatever reason, as Olivia mentioned previously, do not or cannot have an undetectable viral load? And this is really the big but and the caveat here when we're talking about current scientific advances in HIV treatment, is that it is incredibly important that we don't leave anyone behind. Potentially thinking that treatment prevention is somehow a solution for HIV criminalisation is problematic, because it widens an already existing gap between those who fall through the cracks in the system. This is in relation to systemic issues, I think, in healthcare as well as justice. So it's important always to keep these areas in mind. As has already been pointed out, those at the highest risk of HIV criminalisation are already marginalised communities. And what we're seeing in some jurisdictions now in relation to criminalisation is that those being targeted are within an increasingly marginalised subset of people living with HIV that, for various reasons, are not able to obtain an undetectable viral load. So I think we need to be very, very cautious of how we apply scientific advances in the fight to end HIV criminalisation, and I think that potentially it could be used to widen this already existing gulf. That it's only a certain type of people living with HIV, and again, let's put in scare quotes. It's only a certain type of people living with HIV who might be prosecuted, and one that a largely more respectable, and again that's in air quotes, community of people living with HIV, i.e. those willing to go on treatment or able to access treatment, can potentially throw under the bus. And we can't really see that effect happening in media reporting around HIV. As I think was Janet mentioned before, not so much in mainstream media, but in niche media. Here in Australia, we have a large cohort of people living with HIV who are gay and bisexual men. So a lot of HIV reporting is in queer media outlets, and you can really see that gulf and divide between quote-unquote good people living with HIV and bad quote-unquote living with HIV when it comes to issues of HIV criminalisation. So I think we really need to be mindful of that and leave absolutely no one behind. In relation to HIV science, beyond treatment prevention and undetectability, I think it's also important to point out that some people, including people in the media, are not interested in up-to-date science. This is very sadly not a phenomenon exclusive to HIV. We only just have to look over towards the way that climate change is discussed in media and politics to know that unfortunately, you can have all the science in the world and people just don't care about it when you have an issue that's seen as a moral issue. We have some examples of that here in some jurisdictions here in Australia. We've had the rollout very recently in the last couple of years of mandatory testing for HIV and other viruses through spitting laws in Western Australia, South Australia and Northern Territory, and that is where anyone who spits on a police officer or another first responder can be detained and mandatorily tested for HIV. Obviously, the scientific risk associated with contracting HIV through spitting is do we say non-existent? It's not an issue. But even though that science was available, getting that information communicated to the police and other services unions who were fighting for those mandatory testing laws to come through, and through the media reporting, was very, very difficult. And we had consensus statements by some of the greatest scientific minds in the country, and none of that really penetrated and got through. So I think that's important to note, is that we can have all the up-to-date science in the world, and we have to be very mindful of how, as was mentioned before, things are being framed. I think it's also important to note that the media's ability to distill detailed scientific information around HIV and communicate that to the public is something that can't necessarily always be relied on. So when we are in the position of being kind of on the back foot with getting media stories out there about HIV criminalisation, in that they are often framed in portrait mode, i.e. they are about an individual case. I think that can be really tricky at times to get that up-to-date scientific messaging across. But if we go back a couple of steps and we talk about a broader media advocacy strategy when it comes to criminalisation, we can be seeding these science update stories through the media more and more, so that when individual HIV criminalisation stories come up, you hopefully already have a fertile media environment in which public awareness and media awareness of what it is to live with HIV in 2018 is radically different. Here in Australia, almost every HIV story in the mainstream media refers back to one single ad campaign in the 1980s called the Grim Reaper campaign, which created a lot of stigma and a lot of fear. And people often ping back to that. But these days they ping back to it to comment on how far things have come. And I think that's something that can work to our advantage at times. And that's everything.
Excellent, Nick. Nick, thank you so much, again, for illuminating what's really an evolving conversation around using science in our messaging and in general, really important points. So now, next slide, please. And we're just going to linger very quickly on this slide. I'm going to let the headline speak for itself, and I'm going to point to the toolkit for folks for more details on different aspects of gathering comrades, allies, and accomplices, as because I want to make sure that our final panelist has her full time to speak from her expertise. So you can just move on to the very next slide with the next question, which I'm going to pass to Chikandi Chikozi from TREA in Maui. I would love to hear, what are your tips for engaging with allies working on intersecting issues, because again, HIV criminalization and HIV generally is an intersectional issue relevant to many communities. And also, how do you tailor messages to help other groups recognize their own stake in opposing HIV criminalization? Chikandi?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Olivia. I will start by answering the first part of the question, which is what are the tips for engaging with allies working on intersecting issues? I'll answer by sharing the experience that we had here in Malawi when we were advocating against the HIV bill, which had criminalized HIV/AIDS. One thing that came out from the advocacy work that we're doing, and that was something that all of us learned throughout the process, was that at the beginning of the advocacy, the voice of the affected was not present. The experts had taken the lead in advocating against criminalization of HIV/AIDS, and for years, the experts and the advocates had tried to speak to the parliamentarians and government to make sure that the law does not come to pass. But then there was a lot of resistance because the people that really were affected were not being heard. So Only at the end of the advocacy work, when we finally had the HIV bill passed, and where these sections that had provided for criminalization of HIV/AIDS were removed, we had groups of women that came into the advocacy work. So what the experts did and advocates did was to strategize on who are our allies. That's the first question that we had to ask ourselves, because we had been working with the parliamentarians for a long time and things were not really moving. So we had to look again and go back to ask the question, who are our allies? And we realized that the voice of the affected was not part of the advocacy work. So what we did was, each and every organization that was involved in terms of activists and advocates, we looked at the people that we're representing. So, for example, as CREA, the organization that I work for, we work with sex workers. We looked at that as people that we're standing for. And we said, we need to bring the sex workers on board. And then we had other organizations that work with women living with HIV/AIDS. And we said, let's bring the women on board. And all the other groups that were involved all thought about the people that they were representing and said, let's bring these people together. And how we changed the strategy was that we decided to put the people affected in front of the advocacy work. So now we said, us as advocates, we have to be in the backstage and let these people take lead. So what we did was to organize a meeting where all the affected groups were brought together, and we had to listen to the issues that they had, their concerns that they had. And also, because what we realized was that even the affected did not even know so much about the law that was going to be passed. They didn't even understand how the law is going to affect them. So first of all, we had to explain to them what the law was going to be if it was passed, and how that law is going to affect them. And then we also had to hear from their side, after hearing what the law is about, how they felt the law is going to affect them. And then we had to let them formulate the message that they wanted to put across to the parliamentarians in their own way. So they came up with their own messages on how they're going to speak to the parliamentarians based on the information that they received in terms of how the law is going to affect them. So they came up with their own messages, and it was so amazing, because at the time that we met with the parliamentarians, the experts and the advocates did not speak. It was the affected people that spoke. And when they spoke, they really moved the parliamentarians. It was one of the most exciting moments of my life, because I was part of that session, and seeing how the women spoke so powerfully, and they just spoke in plain language. They did not even speak in terms of the technicalities of the law, but they looked at how the law itself is going to affect them individually. And even some of them were even political in their speech when speaking to the parliamentarians. One woman told the parliamentarians that women are the ones that vote in Malawi, and if this law comes into pass, the women are the ones that are going to be affected, because women are the group that know their status first in most cases, because of antenatal care and other issues that women go to the hospital for. So they are the first ones to know their status. So if we criminalize HIV/AIDS and these women end in prison, it means you not have women voting for you. You not have women attending your rallies and all that. So the parliamentarians were really moved by these messages. And so the point I'm trying to make is that we need to know our allies and make sure that when you know them, you also let them speak, especially where it involves the affected group. But also on the allies, in terms of decision makers, we also identified in our case those people that we thought were on our side, those that we felt that they were on our side, and we made sure that at the meetings that we wanted to influence those that were not on our side, we let those ones speak. So even though in some parliamentarians who already supported the cause that the HIV criminalization was wrong. So we had to bring those on board to speak to the others. And we also had to understand why the other parliamentarians were against, they were for criminalization of HIV/AIDS. And one of the issues that came out strongly was that most of them felt like that by not criminalizing HIV/AIDS, we are creating a situation where a child is defiled or a woman is raped by a person who's HIV positive. What would be the remedy for that woman? So that issue was coming up constantly throughout the advocacy. Even when the bill came in Parliament, where the bill was being debated for the second time, that issue also came out from so many members of Parliament who commented on the bill. They were so concerned that the purpose of criminalizing HIV/AIDS was that we should deal with people who intentionally and recklessly infect others, and mostly in cases where there's non-consensual sexual activity. So we had to understand that argument. So the time that we were doing the advocacy, we understood that argument, and we had to come up with messages that would speak to that argument. And what we did was to look at the law existing already, like in terms of defilement and rape. We already have the law that actually criminalizes that. So we spoke to them and said, you know, we already have a law that actually criminalizes that. So if a person defiles someone or rapes someone, whether they are HIV positive or not, they'll still be tried for that offense. So there is no need to have a law specifically just to criminalize HIV, because we're feeling that if a person is HIV positive and they rape someone, because still more we already have a law that will actually catch up those people. So through understanding the arguments that the other side have, we are able to actually come up with messages that would speak to them and convince them why we shouldn't have a law that criminalizes HIV/AIDS. And also, one thing that I would want to talk about in terms of the second part of the question, how you tailor your message, is what the other panelists have already spoken about, is speaking to issues like why HIV criminalization is bad. One of the things is what I've already alluded to in terms of what the women told the parliamentarians, that if they criminalize HIV/AIDS, it's going to affect the women, and that by affecting women, it also has an impact on the members of parliament in cases of Malawi, because they will not have the women voting for them. Although that was a political statement, but because these were politicians, it really touched to their hearts. So I think there's also need to, in some cases, to be even more political, because you know the audience that you're speaking to. And also the other issue, sorry, I have a code. So the other issue is the practicability of proof in terms of HIV/AIDS criminalization, because we had to speak to the members of parliament that if we have to criminalize HIV/AIDS, how are we going to prove it? How are you going to prove beyond reasonable doubt that this is the person who transmitted the HIV/AIDS to the other person? So we had to speak to those things, like how practical is that? And that's something that also really helped to actually move the members of parliament to understand that it's going to be very hard and almost impossible to prove that so and so is the one who actually transmitted the virus to the other person. So by speaking to those things, it actually helped for people to understand, because the way the law was crafted, just by looking at it on the face of it, it looked like it was to benefit the women. And for those people that spoke for the criminalization of HIV/AIDS, and that's the message that they kept on saying, that no, this law is actually intended to protect women, because if someone actually takes advantage of a woman and the person is HIV positive, there has to be a law that actually prohibits that. So by now breaking down the law and looking at the practicability of it and saying, how are we going to be able to prove who is going to be a victim of this law? They actually realized that it was going to be the women actually who are going to be victims of the offense. So by speaking to that practicability of proof, it also helped to actually make the parliamentarians realize that it was not good law to actually have HIV/AIDS criminalized. Yes, and then one last thing that I wanted to say is that the messages they have to be put in a very simple term, because sometimes as advocates we feel like we know it very well, and we feel like by speaking in technical terms it will help. But in our case, what we felt out was a powerful tool was to let the women speak in simple terms in how it affected them. And that was something that for us, we thought that it worked. And throughout the advocacy work, after we realized the need of involving the affected, we let the women take the lead, and the sex workers and all the affected groups. And that really, really helped, because the decision makers, the members of parliament, they saw how passionately the women spoke and how that was going to affect them. And it was through their voices that we were able to move the House of Parliament, and that actually when the law was passed, all those sections that criminalized HIV/AIDS were actually removed in the law. And now we have the HIV/AIDS Act, but now it doesn't have all these sections that criminalized HIV. Thank you.
Chikandi, thank you so much again for really hitting on some of the really important points around working with intersectional or intersecting communities around criminalization. Thank you so much. And next slide, please. We're going to move through the last few quickly, but I'm so glad that that we got to hear from you, Chikandi, once again. Again, and always to have a little bit more, or in some cases, a lot more elaboration, though unfortunately not all of our, the individual experiences shared by our esteemed, amazing panelists today, you can find in the toolkit. These are some of the areas that we didn't get the opportunity to touch on today. I am right now going to put a link to the toolkit in our chat box. And it doesn't look as if we have any questions that are out or are unanswered. There are any final ones. We are a little bit past time. So thank you everyone both for being here and for those who are hanging on a little bit later. Next slide, please. Let's see if there are any, I think that by now, again, we've indicated the Q&A box, the chat box. And it doesn't seem as if there are any questions. If anyone wants to drop in a final one as we're wrapping up, please again feel free in the last moment or so that we're together. But again, thank you so much to those who have asked questions already and for your presence here. I do believe the recording is going to be made available. Jenny, please stop me if I'm wrong about that, but I do believe that it's available to attendees after the session. We're certainly recording now. Is that right? Am I right about that?
Yes, we are recording and it will be available. I'm not sure we can I can put it on PWN's website, and we can send it to HIV Justice Worldwide to put on their website. And yeah, I don't know if there are other methods of distribution, but we could also send a link to folks who are registered for the webinar.
Okay, excellent. That's great. That's multiple people had questions about whether they'd be able to view after. And we can just move over to the second to last slide. Just acknowledge folks whose time, energy, attention, love, expertise went into the development not only of the toolkit but also of this webinar. And of course, this part of the overall HIV Justice Worldwide toolkit. You can download the toolkit there. I've put a direct link in the chat box, but you can also view the wealth of resources available from HIV Justice Worldwide at that toolkit at hivjusticeworldwide.org URL on a variety of topics and for a range of advocacy targets. It's a really fantastic resource for our global community. And finally, we can go to the last slide. Which I'll just say with my mouth, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you many, many times over to our panelists, to everyone who stayed both to till time and after to hear about this this vital topic, this vital aspect of our work, working in and through media around challenging HIV criminalization. As we're closing out, I'll ask my sister and fellow panelists to come off mute, share any final words, say thank you, say goodbye, just right now as we're signing off.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All right.
And thanks to Olivia for organizing this.
Yes, thank
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Huge
Yeah.
congratulations, Olivia, on the resource. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you all for your participation in it. It was really a team effort to rally our voices in this way. Yeah, many thanks again, everyone.
Thanks.
Take very good care. Rest well for those for whom it's evening and even early morning. All right, take good care.
Okay, everyone.
Okay.
Bye, all.
Bye. Bye.